11:47 p.m. I pulled my patrol car onto the shoulder of Highway 92, gravel crunching beneath the tires as I settled into another night of watching empty asphalt stretch toward the horizon. The radio crackled with distant chatter from units closer to town, but out here in the desert borderlands of Pima County, Tuesday nights were usually dead quiet. Just me, the cactus, and whatever unfortunate soul decided to test their luck against the speed limit on these back roads. 3 months into this promotion, and I was still getting used to the solitude. Deputy Alex Moreno had a nice ring to it, even if the badge felt heavier than I'd expected. 27 years old, finally stable employment with decent benefits, and all I had to do was keep the peace in a county where most folks were asleep by 10. Should have been easy money. I adjusted the rearview mirror and caught sight of my own tired eyes. The job wasn't passion. Hell, it wasn't even close. But after bouncing between construction gigs and warehouse work for years, the Pima County Sheriff's Department represented something I'd never had before. Predictability. Regular paychecks, health insurance, maybe even a pension if I stuck around long enough. The desert stretched out on both sides of the highway, all twisted mesquite and barrel cactus silhouetted against the star-heavy sky. No moon tonight, which made the darkness feel deeper than usual. I'd grown up in Phoenix, where the city lights bleached out most of the stars, but out here you could see the Milky Way spreading across the sky like spilled flour. Beautiful, in its own lonely way. My radio squawked. Unit 47, this is dispatch. Status check. I keyed the mic. Unit 47, Highway 92 mile marker 23. All quiet. Copy that. Stay sharp out there, Moreno. Stay sharp. Right. Like anything exciting ever happened on. The roar of engines shattered the desert quiet, and suddenly 2 cars came flying over the hill ahead of me, racing side by side down the center line. I hit my lights and sirens, watching as they separated just enough to avoid a head-on collision with an oncoming semi. The truck's horn blared as it swerved onto the shoulder. Son of a bitch, I muttered, throwing the car into drive. The chase didn't last long. Both cars, a rust-red Camaro with flame decals and a teal Honda with more primer than paint, pulled over about a quarter mile down the road. By the time I approached, 5 kids had piled out and were standing around trying to look innocent. The driver of the Camaro, a lanky kid with bleached hair, stepped forward with his hands raised in mock surrender. "Evening, officer," he said, grinning like this was all some big joke. "Beautiful night for a drive, don't you think?" I kept my flashlight trained on the group while I ran their licenses. All locals, all between 17 and 19. The kind of kids who grew up in small towns and spent their weekends looking for trouble because there wasn't much else to do. "You boys realize you were doing 80 in a 55 zone?" I asked, handing back their IDs. "Racing on a public highway?" The Honda driver, a stocky kid named Miguel Santos, shrugged. "We weren't racing, man. Just synchronized driving." His friends snickered. The girl leaning against the Camaro, Jessica something according to her license, rolled her eyes. "Come on, officer. Moreno, right? We weren't hurting anybody. Road's empty." "Road's empty until it isn't," I said, nodding toward where the semi had nearly ended up in the ditch. "You could have killed yourselves, or someone else. I wrote them tickets. Standard procedure. Reckless driving, excessive speed, nothing too harsh. They were kids being stupid, not career criminals." But as I handed over the citations, the bleached hair kid leaned closer. "Hey, you're the new guy, right? Heard about you from Tommy Valdez. His dad works dispatch. You know you're patrolling the spook roads now, don't you?" "Spook roads?" The girl, Jessica, elbowed him hard. "Shut up, Danny. Don't fill the cop's head with that bullshit." But Danny was on a roll now, playing to his audience. "Nah, seriously, Officer Moreno. You ever heard about the weird shit that goes on out here? The Arantes place? People going missing?" "Danny," Miguel started, but the kid kept talking. "My uncle works for the Park Service, right? Says they get reports of hikers disappearing near the preserve borders, never find the bodies, and nobody's seen an Arantes in town for, 15 years? But their cattle still graze the back sections. Food still gets delivered to their gate, but nobody ever sees who picks it up." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the desert air. "All right, that's enough ghost stories for one night. You kids head home. Drive safe." They piled back into their cars, engines rumbling to life. As the Camaro pulled away, Danny leaned out the window and called back, "Just saying, officer, keep your eyes open out here. Desert gets weird after midnight." 12:23 a.m. After they disappeared down the highway, I sat in my car for a long moment, engine idling. The silence felt different now, heavier, like the darkness was pressing closer to my windows. The Arantes' name wasn't completely unfamiliar. Sheriff Ramirez had mentioned them during my orientation, though he'd been vague about details. Old family, owned a massive ranch that bordered the state preserve. Kept to themselves, rarely caused problems for law enforcement. Good neighbors, Ramirez had called them, though something in his tone suggested there was more to the story. I'd driven past their property line dozens of times over the past 3 months. Miles of chain-link fence topped with barbed wire, weathered signs reading, "Private range, no trespassing," posted every 50 yards. Never saw any cattle, though. Never saw much of anything, actually, except for the dirt access road that disappeared into the scrubland beyond the gate. "Weird shit," the kid had said. "People going missing." I shook my head and pulled back onto the highway. Kids loved their scary stories, especially when they could use them to mess with the new cop. Probably heard the tales from older siblings or parents, stories that got bigger and stranger with each telling. Every small town had its local legends. The radio crackled again, dispatch checking in with units across the county. Normal Tuesday night stuff, a domestic disturbance in town, a possible DUI near the truck stop. Nothing requiring my attention. I continued my patrol, following Highway 92 as it curved around the base of Cemetery Mesa, the massive rock formation that dominated the eastern skyline. That's when I saw him. 12:41 a.m. At first, he was just a shape moving along the roadside, barely visible in the darkness beyond my headlights. I slowed, thinking it might be a stranded motorist or someone who'd had car trouble. But as I got closer, I realized he was walking, just walking along the desert highway in the middle of the night, miles from the nearest town. I pulled over and rolled down my window. "Sir, everything all right?" He turned toward me, and I got my first good look at him in the patrol car's spotlight. Tall, maybe 6'2", with sharp features and skin that looked like it had been weathered by decades of desert sun. His hair was black with streaks of silver, pulled back in a ponytail that hung to his shoulders, but it was his eyes that caught my attention, amber-colored, almost golden, reflecting the light like an animal's. "Good evening, officer," he said, approaching my car with slow, measured steps. His voice was deep, cultured, with just a hint of an accent I couldn't place. "Beautiful night for a walk." "Little dangerous out here in the dark," I said, keeping my tone friendly but professional. "No sidewalks, limited visibility. Where you headed?" He smiled, and I caught a glimpse of teeth that seemed unusually sharp. "Just taking the air. Sometimes the desert calls to you, you know. The silence, the stars." He gestured toward the sky. "You can't experience it properly from inside a vehicle." There was something off about him, though I couldn't put my finger on what. His clothes, for one thing, they looked old-fashioned, not vintage or retro, but genuinely aged. A white button-down shirt that might have been expensive once, dark pants with suspenders, boots that were scuffed but well-maintained, like he'd stepped out of a photograph from 50 years ago. "You live around here?" I asked. "My family has roots in this area," he said, which wasn't really an answer. "Been here longer than most. We know these roads well." "I haven't seen you before. I'm Alex Moreno, new night patrol deputy." "Leandro Arantes," he said, extending his hand through the window. The name hit me like a cold wind. One of them. The mysterious family the kids had been talking about. I shook his hand, surprised by how cold his skin felt despite the warm night. His grip was firm, and I could feel calluses that spoke of hard physical work. "Arantes," I repeated. "You're from the ranch." "Among other places." Another non-answer, delivered with that same unsettling smile. "Tell me, Officer Moreno, How are you finding our little corner of the county? Quiet enough for you? Quiet, yeah. Peaceful. Peace is relative out here, he said, releasing my hand. The desert has its own rhythms, its own dangers. Things move at night that prefer to avoid the daylight hours. I felt a chill run down my spine. What kind of things? Leandro stepped back from the car, his amber eyes scanning the darkness beyond the road. Coyotes mostly, javelinas, mountain lions, though they're rare this far south. He looked back at me, and his expression had grown more serious. But there are other things, Officer Moreno. Things that stalk under the desert stars. Things that hunt. Hunt what? Whatever crosses their path, he said quietly. Whatever strays too far from the safety of the roads. The way he said it made my mouth go dry. There was something in his tone, a certainty that suggested he wasn't speaking hypothetically. Well, I managed. I appreciate the warning. You be careful out here yourself, Mr. Orantes. Want to ride somewhere? No need, he said, already turning away. I know these paths well. They know me. I watched him walk back into the darkness, his figure disappearing into the scrubland as if the desert had simply swallowed him whole. For several minutes I sat there, engine running, trying to shake the unease that had settled over me like a heavy blanket. 1:15 a.m. The rest of my shift passed without incident, but I couldn't stop thinking about the encounter. There had been something deeply unsettling about Leandro Orantes, something that went beyond his strange appearance and cryptic warnings, the way he moved, the way he spoke, like he was playing a role he'd performed countless times before, and those eyes. I'd never seen eyes that color on a human being. As I drove my final patrol loop before heading back to the station, I found myself thinking about the stories Sheriff Ramirez had shared during my first week on the job. Not official briefings, just casual conversation over coffee. Tales passed down from older deputies, stories that had accumulated around certain families and places over the decades. The Orantes Ranch was one of those places. Ramirez had mentioned it almost in passing, the way you might reference a local landmark. But there had been something in his voice, a note of caution that I was only now beginning to understand. They keep to themselves, he'd said. Been that way for generations. Don't cause trouble, don't ask for help. Sometimes you'll see their vehicles on the back roads, but mostly they stick to their own land. How big is their property? I'd asked. 15, maybe 20,000 acres. Bought it piece by piece over the years, always paying cash. Good neighbors, like I said, just private. He'd paused then, staring out the window toward the desert. Funny thing though, never see their kids in town, never see them at the school, the clinic, anywhere you'd expect. Department of Social Services has never had a file on them. It's like they're raising their children completely off the grid. Is that legal? Homeschooling's legal, religious exemptions are legal, and they've never given us cause to investigate. He'd turned back to me with a shrug. Every community has its eccentrics, Moreno. The Orantes just happened to be ours. But there had been other stories too, whispered rumors that Ramirez hadn't shared directly, but that I'd picked up from other deputies. Stories about hikers who'd gone missing near the preserve boundaries, campers who'd packed up in the middle of the night and driven away without explanation, leaving behind expensive equipment and half-cooked meals. Most of it was probably bullshit, small-town gossip amplified by too much time and not enough real news. But sitting here in the desert darkness, remembering the way Leandro Orantes had looked at me with those golden eyes, the stories felt less like folklore and more like warnings. I thought about Danny's uncle, the park service worker who supposedly tracked missing hikers. Maybe I'd look him up tomorrow, ask a few casual questions. Not because I believed in spook stories, but because a good cop pays attention to patterns. And if people really were disappearing near the Orantes property, that was something I needed to know about. The radio crackled to life, dispatch calling the end of shift for units across the county. I acknowledged and turned back toward town, watching Cemetery Mesa fade into the darkness behind me. but I couldn't shake the feeling that something out there was watching me back. 1:32 a.m. I was just pulling into the station parking lot when I saw headlights racing toward me down Main Street. Two familiar cars, the rust-red Camaro and teal Honda from earlier. They screeched to a halt in front of my patrol car, engines still running, and all 5 kids poured out looking like they'd seen death itself. Danny, the bleached hair kid who'd been so cocky about Spook Roads an hour ago, stumbled toward me with his hands shaking. His face was pale, eyes wide with terror that looked genuine. Not the kind of fear you could fake for a prank. "Officer Moreno," he called out, his voice cracking. "You gotta come with us, man. Something's wrong out there. Something's really fucking wrong." "Language," I said automatically, stepping out of my patrol car. "What's the problem?" Jessica pushed past Danny, her earlier attitude completely gone. "We heard screaming," she said, wrapping her arms around herself despite the warm night. "A woman screaming, near Cemetery Mesa, by the Orantes place." Miguel nodded frantically. "It wasn't an animal, officer. I know what coyotes sound like, what bobcats sound like. This was human, a woman in serious trouble." I felt my stomach drop. Cemetery Mesa. Right where Leandro Orantes had been walking earlier, where he'd given me that cryptic warning about things that hunt in the darkness. "Where exactly did you hear this?" I asked, trying to keep my voice level and professional. "The old mining road that runs along the Mesa base," Danny said. We were hanging out, you know? Talking. And then we heard it. This woman, screaming like someone was killing her. How long ago? Maybe 20 minutes? We got the hell out of there as fast as we could. I looked at their faces, searching for any sign this was some elaborate prank, payback for the tickets I'd written them. But the terror in their eyes was real. The way they kept glancing over their shoulders, clustering together like frightened children. You couldn't fake that kind of raw fear. "Did you see anything? Any vehicles? Any people?" "No," Jessica said, shaking her head. "We didn't stick around to look. But officer, the screaming, it went on for minutes. It wasn't someone just startled or hurt. Someone was dying out there." I reached for my radio and keyed it. "Dispatch, this is Unit 47. I need backup at Cemetery Mesa, Old Mining Access Road. Possible assault in progress." The response crackled back immediately. "Unit 47. Nearest available unit is 45 minutes out. Can you wait for backup?" 45 minutes. If someone was actually being attacked out there, they'd be long dead by the time help arrived. I looked at the kids' terrified faces and made a decision I'd regret for the rest of my life. "Negative, dispatch. Situation may be time sensitive. I'm proceeding to investigate." "Copy that, Unit 47. Use extreme caution." I turned back to the teenagers. "You kids go home. Now don't stop anywhere. Don't go back out there. Understand?" They nodded eagerly, already moving toward their cars. As they drove away, I stood alone in the station parking lot, looking out toward the dark silhouette of Cemetery Mesa in the distance. Every instinct I had was screaming at me not to go out there alone. But duty was duty, and if someone needed help, 1:47 a.m. The mining road was little more than a dirt track that wound around the base of Cemetery Mesa, connecting to the main highway about 3 miles from the Orantes ranch boundary. I'd driven it a few times during daylight patrols, but never at night. My headlights carved a narrow tunnel through the darkness, illuminating scattered beryl cactus and the twisted shadows of ocotillo plants. The desert felt different here, more oppressive. The air was still, heavy with the smell of creosote and something else, something faint and acrid, like smoke from a distant fire. I rolled down my windows, listening for any sound that might indicate where the screaming had come from. Nothing but silence, even the usual night sounds, the distant yip of coyotes, the rustle of small animals in the brush, seemed muted here, as if the desert itself was holding its breath. I parked where the road curved closest to the mesa's base and grabbed my flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing the rocky slope that rose up toward the mesa's flat top. Scattered across the ground were the usual desert plants, but also something that made my blood run cold, clear tire tracks in the soft sand, fresh enough that they hadn't been disturbed by wind. 2 vehicles from the look of it. One set of tracks led deeper into the scrubland, toward a cluster of mesquite trees that grew thick near what looked like a seasonal wash. The other set circled back toward the road, as if whoever had been driving had left in a hurry. I followed the first set of tracks, my flashlight beam dancing across the uneven ground. The silence was absolute now, so complete that I could hear my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. Every few steps I stopped, listening, but there was nothing. Then I saw it, a flash of white against the dark ground. I approached cautiously, my hand instinctively moving to rest on my service weapon. It was a card, about the size of a playing card, made of what looked like bone or bleached wood. Crude symbols had been scratched into its surface, along with words written in dark ink that looked disturbingly like dried blood. "Keep away." I stared at it for a long moment, my hands starting to shake. This wasn't some random piece of litter. Someone had made this, placed it here deliberately. A warning, or maybe a threat. The rational part of my mind said I should photograph it as evidence, bag it, take it back to the station. But something deeper, more primitive, told me not to touch it, not to take it with me. I left it where it lay and continued following the tracks. 2:03 a.m. The tracks led me deeper into the scrubland, winding between clusters of prickly pear and chala cactus. I was maybe 100 yards from my patrol car now, though I'd lost sight of the headlights completely. The mesquite trees grew thicker here, their thorny branches creating a maze of shadows that my flashlight could barely penetrate. That's when I started to see signs of a struggle. Broken branches, disturbed ground, dark stains on the rocks that could have been blood, and caught on a thorn bush, a piece of fabric, light blue cotton, like from a woman's shirt or dress. I keyed my radio. "Dispatch, Unit 47. I've found evidence of a possible assault at Cemetery Mesa. Requesting crime scene unit and coroner." "Copy, Unit 47. ETA on backup is 30 minutes. Crime scene unit is being dispatched." 30 minutes. I looked around at the maze of thorny bushes and deep shadows, feeling more isolated than I ever had in my life. The smart thing would be to secure the perimeter and wait for backup. Mark the evidence, photograph everything, do it by the book. But then I heard it. A sound so faint I almost missed it. A low moan, barely audible above the desert wind. Human. Female. Coming from somewhere ahead of me, deeper in the scrubland. "Hello?" I called out, moving toward the sound. "This is police. Can you hear me?" The moan came again, weaker this time. I quickened my pace, pushing through the thorny branches that caught at my uniform. My flashlight beam swept back and forth, searching for any sign of movement. The ground dropped away suddenly, and I found myself standing at the edge of a deep wash, one of those seasonal creek beds that carved through the desert landscape. In the rainy season, it would carry flash floods down from the mesa, but now it was bone dry, filled with nothing but sand and scattered rocks, and that's when my foot slipped on the loose stone at the edge, and I tumbled down into the darkness. 2:18 a.m. The fall couldn't have been more than 10 feet, but I landed hard on my shoulder and rolled, my flashlight flying from my grip. For a moment I lay there stunned, tasting blood where I'd bitten my tongue. Then I reached out, feeling around in the sand for my light. My hand touched something soft. Fabric. Still warm. I jerked back with a gasp, scrambling away from whatever I'd touched. My fingers finally found my flashlight, and I clicked it on with shaking hands. The beam illuminated a nightmare. She was lying on her side in the sand, one arm stretched out as if reaching for help that would never come. Her clothes, a light blue dress that matched the fabric I'd found earlier, were torn and blood-stained. But it was her face that made me vomit into the sand beside her. Or what had been her face. Something had torn it apart, left nothing recognizable, just raw meat and exposed bone, eye sockets empty and dark. Her throat had been ripped open, and dark blood had soaked into the sand beneath her head. I tried to stand, tried to back away, but my legs wouldn't support me. This wasn't a murder, wasn't anything human. No knife could have done this, no gun. This was something else entirely, something that had used claws and teeth to tear a human being apart. I fumbled for my radio, hands shaking so badly I could barely work the controls. "Dispatch," I whispered. I found, there's a body. Female, deceased. Appears to be Jesus Christ ... Unit 47, repeat, you're breaking up. I tried to speak again, but the words wouldn't come, because I'd heard something else, a sound from above me, from the rim of the wash, a soft scraping like claws against stone. I looked up, my flashlight beam sweeping toward the sound, and froze. 2:22 a.m. The figure perched in the twisted branches of a mesquite tree that overhung the wash was not human. Not entirely. It crouched on the gnarled limb like some prehistoric bird of prey, perfectly balanced despite its size. Male, I thought, though it was hard to tell. Shirtless, with skin that looked like weathered leather stretched over two long bones. Its arms were unnaturally elongated, ending in hands tipped with curved claws that glinted in my flashlight beam. But it was the mask that made my blood turn to ice. A jaguar skull, bleached white by the desert sun, sat where a human face should be. Empty eye sockets had been fitted with something that glowed with sickly yellow light, like the eyes of an animal caught in headlights. The skull's fanged jaw hung open slightly, revealing human teeth beneath, sharp, filed to points. And stretching out behind it, attached to its shoulders by what looked like crude leather strapping, were wings. Black feathered wings that seemed too large for the creature's body, trailing dark stains that could only be dried blood. It studied me with those glowing yellow eyes, tilting its head with bird-like curiosity. When it spoke, its voice was barely a whisper, but in the absolute silence of the wash, it might as well have been a shout. "You crossed the wrong line, Officer Moreno." My hand went to my service weapon, muscle memory taking over when conscious thought failed. But my fingers were numb, unresponsive. The gun might as well have been a toy for all the good it would do me. "I know who you are," the thing continued, never taking those terrible eyes off me. "Talked to my cousin earlier tonight. He said you seemed curious about our family, about the stories people tell. Leandro, the man I'd met on the highway. This thing was related to him somehow, part of the same impossible family that lived in the shadows of the desert." "What ... I croaked, finally finding my voice. "What are you?" The jaguar skull tilted the other way, and I heard what might have been laughter from behind the bone mask. "What am I? I'm what happens when the old blood runs true, when the desert takes back what was always hers." It shifted on the branch, and I caught a glimpse of its feet, or what had once been feet. Now they were more like talons, curved and sharp, gripping the wood with supernatural strength. "That woman," I managed, nodding toward the corpse beside me. "Did you—" "She wandered where she shouldn't have wandered," the creature said simply. "Ignored the warnings, crossed the boundary. The desert doesn't forgive trespassers, Officer Moreno. Neither do we." The wings spread slightly, casting deeper shadows across the wash. In the flashlight beam, I could see that they weren't just attached to the creature's shoulders. They'd been stitched there, crudely sewn into the flesh with what looked like sinew or leather cord. Dark blood seeped from the suture lines, dripping slowly onto the sand below. "You're going to report this," it said, not really a question. "Tell them what you found, what you saw." I wanted to lie, wanted to tell it I'd keep quiet, forget everything. But something about those glowing eyes told me it would know if I wasn't being truthful. "I have to," I whispered. "It's my job." The creature laughed again, a sound like wind through dry bones. "Your job, yes. Duty, honor, all those pretty words they taught you at the academy. It leaned forward on the branch, bringing that terrible skull mask closer to where I crouched beside the body. "Tell me, Officer Moreno, what exactly will you report? That you found a woman torn apart by wild animals? That you saw things in the desert that couldn't possibly exist?" The truth hit me like a physical blow. Who would believe me? Who could believe me? A story about winged creatures with jaguar masks and glowing eyes. They'd think I'd suffered a breakdown, recommend psychological evaluation. My career would be over before it really began. Nobody would believe me, I said. "No," the creature agreed. "They wouldn't. So what will you tell them?" Before I could answer, it spread those horrible stitched wings wide and launched itself from the tree. For a moment it seemed to hang in the air above me, a nightmare silhouette against the star-filled sky. Then it was gone, vanished into the darkness as if it had never existed at all. I was alone in the wash with the dead woman and the smell of blood and the terrible certainty that my life had just changed forever. 2:35 a.m. By the time backup arrived, I had my story straight. Woman's body in the wash, probably attacked by a mountain lion or pack of coyotes. No witnesses, no suspects. Just another tragedy in the endless desert where predators ruled the night. I never mentioned the jaguar-masked creature or the white talisman card or the way those glowing eyes had seemed to look right through to my soul. What would have been the point? But as the crime scene unit documented the body and the coroner loaded her into the van, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from the darkness beyond our lights, waiting to see what I would do next. The desert had shown me one of its secrets, and now I was part of it whether I wanted to be or not. 2:36 a.m. The crime scene unit hadn't even finished setting up their lights when I heard it, a low whistle that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Not human, but not quite animal either. Something in between that made my skin crawl. Detective Sarah Chen looked up from her notebook. "What was that?" "Probably a coyote," I said, though every instinct told me it wasn't. Desert gets active at night. But I knew better now. I'd seen what lived in the shadows beyond our floodlights, and the whistle sounded like a signal, like something calling to its own kind. The coroner was photographing the body when the lights went out. Not all at once. That would have been too obvious, too much like a movie. Instead, they flickered and dimmed, one by one, until we were standing in near total darkness with only our flashlights cutting weak beams through the black. "Generator must be acting up," Chen muttered, but her voice had an edge to it. Everyone felt it, that sudden shift in the air, the way the desert silence seemed to press closer. I stepped away from the group, ostensibly to check my patrol car, but really because something was drawing me back toward the wash, back toward where I'd first seen those glowing yellow eyes in the mesquite tree. The jaguar-masked creature was still there, perched motionless on the same gnarled branch, waiting. "Officer Moreno," it said, and its voice carried clearly across the distance despite being barely a whisper. "Step away from them. Now." I looked back at the crime scene team, all of them focused on their equipment, trying to get the lights working again. They couldn't see what I was seeing, couldn't hear what I was hearing. Maybe they weren't meant to. "I can't," I called back softly. "I'm working." The creature tilted its head, the jaguar skull catching starlight. "You misunderstand. That wasn't a request." And then it whistled. That same eerie sound we'd heard before. But this time, it was answered. 2:41 a.m. They came from the darkness like something out of a fever dream, materializing from behind cacti and rock formations as if they'd been there all along, just waiting for the signal. More of them, more of the Orantes family. A teenage girl emerged from behind a cluster of barrel cactus, maybe 16 or 17 years old. She might have looked normal from a distance, but up close I could see that her fingers ended in curved claws like a coyote's, and her teeth were too sharp, too numerous for a human mouth. Her eyes glowed the same sickly yellow as her relatives, and she wore what looked like dried animal bones braided into her long black hair. An older man stepped out from the shadow of a boulder, tall and gaunt, with arms that hung too long at his sides. His face was hidden behind a mask made from a ram's skull, complete with curved horns that spiraled back from his temples. Leather straps bound it to his head, and dark stains marked where the straps had rubbed his skin raw. More shapes moved in the peripheral darkness. I couldn't get a clear count, but at least 5 or 6 of them, all wearing animal masks, all with that same predatory stillness that marked them as something other than human. They formed a loose circle around the wash, their glowing eyes fixed not on me, but on something beyond, deeper in the desert. That's when I heard the answering call. It started as a sound like wind through dead branches, but quickly escalated into something that made my blood freeze. A shriek that seemed to come from multiple throats at once, human voices layered over each other but wrong, distorted, like a recording played at the wrong speed. "Ah!" the jaguar-masked creature said from its perch. "The neighbors." 2:44 a.m. They came from the deeper desert, from the direction of the state preserve, and they moved like nothing I'd ever seen. Tall as trees, skeletal thin, with limbs that seemed to bend in too many places. In the faint starlight, they looked like walking stick insects, all sharp angles and impossible joints. But as they got closer, I realized they weren't insects at all. They were deer, or had been once. Now they were something else entirely, something that wore the shape of deer the way the Orantes family wore animal masks. Their antlers were massive, spreading wide as a man's outstretched arms, but the bone was diseased, mottled with patches of rot that gave off a sickly, phosphorescent glow. Their flesh hung loose on their frames, strips of meat and hide that had partially rotted away to reveal gleaming bone beneath. Some walked on 2 legs like men, others bounded forward on all 4s, but all of them moved with a fluid grace that defied their decaying appearance. And they were screaming, not the normal sounds deer make, but human voices, men and women and children all crying out in terror and agony, as if the creatures' throats had somehow captured the final moments of their victims. "Boundary walkers," the teenage girl with coyote claws said, her voice carrying a note of disgust. "They've crossed into our territory again." The jaguar-masked creature dropped from its branch, landing silently in the sand beside me. Up close, I could see that its stitched wings weren't just decorative, they were functional, the black feathers ruffling with each movement, blood still seeping from where they'd been sewn into the shoulder muscles. "This is what happens, Officer Moreno, when the old agreements are broken," it said, "when the boundaries aren't respected." The lead deer thing, if you could call it a leader, stepped forward on legs that bent backward at the knee like a bird's. When it opened its mouth, the voice that came out was that of a young woman, high and pleading. "Please," it said with the woman's voice. "Please, I have children. Don't do this, please." But the words didn't match the creature's movements. It was advancing on the Orantes family with clear predatory intent, its massive antlers lowered like weapons. "The preserve is ours," another deer thing said in an old man's voice. "Has always been ours. You and your kind have no claim here." "Bullshit," the girl with coyote claws spat. "We were here first, before your kind crawled up from whatever hole spawned you." The tension was building, crackling in the air like electricity before a storm. I found myself caught between 2 groups of monsters, each claiming territorial rights to land that, as far as I knew, belonged to the state of Arizona. "I should go," I whispered to the jaguar-masked creature. "My people will be looking for me." It turned those terrible yellow eyes on me. "Too late for that now. You're in the middle of it whether you like it or not." 2:47 a.m. The battle erupted without warning. One moment they were facing off, trading insults and stolen human voices, and the next the desert was filled with the sounds of violence. Snarling, shrieking, the wet sound of claws tearing flesh. The deer things moved faster than anything that size should have been able to, covering the ground between them and the Orantes family in seconds. The girl with coyote claws met the first attacker head-on, her human form blurring and shifting until she was something between girl and predator, all teeth and claws and savage fury. She latched onto the deer thing's throat, worrying at it like a dog with a bone while it tried to shake her off. The man with the ram skull mask charged into the fray wielding what looked like a war club made from a human femur. His movements were fluid, practiced, like he'd done this many times before. He brought the bone club down on a deer thing's skull with a wet crack that echoed across the desert. But there were more of the deer creatures than I'd initially counted. 8, maybe 10 of them, pouring out of the scrubland like a tide of rot and bone. They moved in coordinated attacks, trying to overwhelm the Orontes family through sheer numbers. I pressed myself against the wall of the wash, trying to stay out of the way of the carnage, but it was everywhere. Above me, around me, the desert floor had become a battlefield where impossible things fought with tooth and claw over territory I couldn't understand. One of the deer things broke away from the main fight and fixed its attention on me. It had been human once. I could see that in the shape of its torso, the way it held itself upright, but its head was pure deer skull, empty sockets filled with the same phosphorescent glow that marked its antlers. "New meat," it said in a child's voice, sweet and innocent. "Haven't tasted new meat in so long." It started toward me, moving with that horrible fluid grace, and I finally remembered I had a gun. 2:51 a.m. My service weapon felt like a toy in my hands as I drew it, the familiar weight providing no comfort against something that had already proven physics didn't apply to it. But training took over. Feet apart, two-handed grip, center mass target. I fired 3 times in rapid succession, the muzzle flashes lighting up the creature's decaying features with stark clarity. All 3 shots hit. I was close enough that missing would have been impossible, but the bullets passed through the creature's body like it was made of smoke. No, not through. Into. I could see the entry wounds, dark holes in the rotting flesh, but there was no blood, no indication that the creature felt any pain. It just kept coming. "Bullets don't work on the dead, little officer," it said in that horrible child's voice. "Should have brought salt or fire. Fire always works." It was close enough that I could smell it now. The stench of carrion, of things left too long in the sun. Its skeletal fingers reached for my throat, and I knew I was about to die in the most horrible way possible. That's when Leandro slammed into it from the side. I'd met him on the highway just hours earlier, the polite man with amber eyes who'd warned me about desert dangers. Now I saw what he really was, what all of them really were. His human appearance had melted away like a mask, revealing something that was part man, part beast, part something else entirely. Wings sprouted from his shoulders, not the crude stitched-on appendages of his relative, but organic, functional wings covered in dark feathers that seemed to absorb light. His face had elongated into something almost wolf-like, but with too many teeth, and his hands ended in claws that gleamed like polished obsidian. He hit the deer thing with enough force to send it tumbling across the sand, then followed up with a vicious swipe of his claws that opened its throat from ear to ear. The creature let out a shriek that sounded like a dozen voices screaming at once, then collapsed in a heap of bone and rotting meat. But the effort had cost him. I could see deep gouges across his chest where the deer thing's claws had found their mark, and one of his wings hung at an odd angle, dark blood dripping from torn feathers. "Stay down," he snarled at me, his voice deeper than before, more animal than human. "And don't interfere." 2:54 a.m. The battle was winding down, but the carnage was extensive. The sand around the wash was soaked with blood, some red, some black, some colors that didn't exist in nature. Bodies lay scattered across the desert floor, most of them the deer things, but a few that had once been members of the Orontes family. The teenage girl with coyote claws sat propped against a rock, holding her side where something had torn through her ribs. Her animal mask had been knocked askew, revealing a face that was young and frightened despite the predator's fangs that filled her mouth. The man with the ram skull was tending to his own wounds, using strips of cloth torn from his shirt to bind a gash on his arm. His bone club lay broken beside him, snapped in half during the fight. And Leandro? Leandro was in the worst shape of all. The deer thing's attack had done more damage than I'd initially realized. His left wing wasn't just hanging wrong, it was barely attached, held on by what looked like leather straps and crude stitching that had been torn apart in the fight. "Jesus," I whispered, staring at the makeshift construction. "Those aren't real." He looked at me with those amber eyes, now more animal than human. "Real enough for what we need them for," he said. "But you're right. We're not what we appear to be. None of us are." The wing finally gave way, tearing free from his shoulder with a wet sound that made me gag. It fell to the sand like a broken umbrella, revealing the crude surgery that had attached it. Holes drilled through bone, sinew threaded through muscle, the whole thing held together with a combination of will and desperation. "We adapt," he said simply, as if losing a wing was no more significant than losing a shoe. "We become what the desert needs us to become. But it's not always pretty." The girl with coyote claws laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Pretty? Look around, cousin. Nothing about this is pretty. We're monsters playing at being human, and humans playing at being monsters. The only difference is which of us admits what we are." 3:02 a.m. As dawn approached, still hours away but somehow felt in the desert air, the surviving members of the Orantes family began to gather their dead and wounded. They moved with practiced efficiency, as if this was routine for them, just another territorial dispute in an ongoing war I couldn't begin to understand. The dear things were left where they fell. Within minutes of dying, their bodies had begun to dissolve, rotting flesh sloughing away until only bones remained. And even those were crumbling, turning to dust that the desert wind scattered across the sand. "They don't belong here," the girl with coyote claws explained when she saw me staring. "This isn't their place, isn't their time. They're echoes, ghosts wearing the shapes of things that died long ago. When the desert rejects them, they fade." I watched Leandro bind his shoulder wound with strips of leather, his movements careful and practiced. The loss of his wing didn't seem to bother him beyond the practical inconvenience. "What about you?" I asked. "What are you really?" He looked at me for a long moment, and for just an instant, I saw something human in those amber eyes, something tired and sad and infinitely old. "We're what's left," he said finally. "What remains when everything else is taken away. The desert doesn't give up its secrets easily, Officer Moreno. It demands payment for every mystery it reveals. We've been paying that price for longer than you can imagine." The ram-skulled man approached, his bone club replaced with a fresh weapon carved from what looked like a deer antler. "We should go," he said. "Dawn brings other hunters, things that won't be as easy to kill as these." They began to move away from the wash, fading back into the scrubland like shadows. But Leandro lingered, turning back to look at me one last time. "You've seen too much," he said, "but you're still breathing. That means something. Don't waste the gift." And then they were gone, vanished into the desert as if they'd never existed at all. I was alone with the bones of monsters and the growing certainty that my life would never be the same again. 3:08 a.m. By the time I made it back to the crime scene, the lights were working again and the investigation was proceeding normally. Detective Chen looked up as I approached, noting my disheveled appearance and the tears in my uniform. "Where the hell have you been, Moreno?" "We've been looking for you." "Thought I heard something," I said. "Checked the perimeter, probably just coyotes." She studied my face in the harsh glare of the floodlights. "You look like you've seen a ghost. If only it had been that simple. Ghosts I could handle. Ghosts were just memories, echoes of what used to be. What I'd witnessed was something far worse, the living nightmare of what we might become when pushed beyond all human limits. Just the desert playing tricks," I told her. "You know how it is out here at night." But even as I said it, I could feel eyes watching me from the darkness beyond our lights. Yellow eyes that glowed with inhuman intelligence, waiting to see what I would do with the knowledge I'd gained. The desert had shown me its secret war, had pulled back the curtain on the things that hunted in the spaces between human understanding. and somehow, impossibly, I was still alive to tell about it. The question was, what was I going to do now? 3:15 a.m. Detective Chen finished photographing the scene and started packing up her equipment. The coroner had already loaded the body into the van, and the crime scene techs were rolling up their cables. Another night in the desert, another unexplained death that would go into the files as an animal attack. "You sure you're okay, Moreno?" Chen asked, studying my face in the dying light of the work lamps. "You look like hell." "Just tired," I said. Long shift. But tired didn't begin to cover it. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those dear things dissolving into bone dust, heard the wet sound of Leandro's wing tearing away from his shoulder. The normal world, police work, evidence collection, official reports, felt like a thin veneer over something vast and terrible that lived just beneath the surface. "Why don't you head back to the station?" Chen suggested. "Get some coffee, write up your report. I can handle the cleanup here." I nodded, grateful for the excuse to leave. But as I walked back toward my patrol car, parked at the edge of the wash where this nightmare had started, I could feel eyes watching me from the darkness. Yellow eyes that glowed with inhuman intelligence. He was waiting for me by the driver's side door. Leandro stood in the shadow of my patrol car, his human appearance restored but somehow more unsettling than his monstrous form had been. The polite man with amber eyes and old-fashioned clothes, as if nothing had happened, as if I hadn't just watched him tear a rotting deer creature apart with his bare claws. "Officer Moreno," he said quietly, "we need to talk." I glanced back toward the crime scene. Chen and the others were maybe 50 yards away, focused on their work, but close enough to hear if I called for help. Not that help would do any good against something that could survive having bullets pass through its body. "What do you want?" I whispered. "To understand what you think you witnessed tonight," he said, taking a step closer. In the faint starlight, I could see that his shoulder was bandaged with strips of what looked like animal hide, dark stains seeping through where his wing had been attached. Before we decide what to do about it, his hand moved to my arm, and I felt the sharp prick of claws against my skin through the fabric of my uniform, not breaking the skin, not yet, but the threat was unmistakable. "Let's take a little walk," he suggested. 3:22 a.m. He led me away from the lights and the voices of the investigation team, deeper into the scrubland where the battle had taken place. The sand was still stained with blood, some red, some black, some colors that hurt to look at directly. Scattered bones that had once been the dear things glinted white in the starlight. "Quite a mess," Leandro observed, nudging a skull with his boot, but necessary. They'd been getting bold lately, crossing further and further into our territory. Tonight, they went too far. "Territory," I repeated. "This is state land, protected preserve." He laughed, a sound like wind through dry leaves. "Protected? Yes, that's what the signs say. But protected by whom? Protected from what?" He turned those amber eyes on me. "The desert doesn't recognize your government's claims, Officer Moreno. It has its own laws, its own boundaries, much older than anything your kind has written down." We stopped at the edge of a cluster of barrel cactus, their spines catching starlight like thousands of tiny needles. Leandro sat on a fallen log, casual as if we were having a friendly conversation instead of a potential execution. "Now then," he said, "I have some questions for you. Answer them truthfully, and you might live to see sunrise." My hand instinctively moved toward my service weapon, but he caught the motion and shook his head. "We both know that won't help you. But I'm curious. Do you understand why you're still breathing when others who've seen what you've seen are not?" I thought about the mutilated woman in the wash, about the stories of missing hikers and campers, people who'd stumbled onto something they weren't supposed to see and paid for it with their lives. "Because I didn't run," I said, "because I stayed and watched." "Partially correct," he acknowledged, "but there's more to it than that. You see, Officer Moreno, most people who witness our disagreements, they panic. They run screaming into the desert, broadcasting their terror for miles. They become a liability. He leaned forward, those predator's eyes fixed on mine. But you're different. When that deer thing came for you, you didn't run. You drew your weapon. You fought. Ineffectively, but you fought. Anyone would have... No, he interrupted. Not anyone. Most would have frozen or curled up in a ball or fainted from shock. But you acted like what you are, a predator in your own right. That's why you're still alive. That's why we're having this conversation instead of adding your bones to the collection. The casual way he said it made my skin crawl. This wasn't his first interrogation. There had been others, people who'd seen too much and failed whatever test he was about to give me. So, here's how this works, Leandro continued. I'm going to ask you 3 questions. Answer them correctly, and you walk away. Lie to me, try to play games, and you'll join that woman in the wash. Understand? I nodded, not trusting my voice. 3:28 a.m. First question, he said, and his voice carried the weight of absolute authority. What did you see tonight? The truth rose in my throat like bile. Creatures that weren't human fighting monsters that used to be deer, wings stitched onto human backs with crude surgery, voices of the dead screaming from rotting throats. Everything I'd witnessed, everything that would sound like the ravings of a madman if I tried to report it. But that wasn't what he wanted to hear. Nothing, I said. I didn't see anything. Elaborate. I forced myself to meet his gaze. I investigated reports of screaming near Cemetery Mesa. Found a woman's body, probably killed by wild animals. Coyotes, maybe, or a mountain lion. Happens sometimes in the desert. He nodded slowly. Good. And when your fellow officers ask why you were gone for so long? I got turned around in the dark. Desert all looks the same at night. Took a while to find my way back. Excellent. His smile was sharp, predatory. Second question, what is my name? This one was easier. I stared at him blankly, letting confusion show on my face. I don't know what you mean. We've never met before tonight, have we, Officer Moreno? No, I said. Never. And if someone were to ask you to describe the man you spoke with on Highway 92 earlier this evening, I didn't speak with anyone on Highway 92, just made my regular patrol. Everything was quiet. Very good. The approval in his voice was almost worse than outright threat. Final question. What will you report about tonight's activities? I thought about Detective Chen, about the crime scene report I'd have to file, about Sheriff Ramirez reading over my account of what had happened. What could I possibly say that wouldn't end my career or get me committed to a psychiatric facility? Kids playing pranks, I said. The teenagers who reported the screaming were probably just trying to scare each other. Ghost stories, you know, urban legends. When they heard coyotes howling, their imaginations got the better of them. And the woman's body? Unrelated. Probably been there for days. Animals got to it, made it hard to identify the cause of death. Coroner will rule it natural causes or animal attack. Case closed. Leandro leaned back against the cactus, apparently unconcerned about the spines pressing against his back. Outstanding. You learn quickly, Officer Moreno. Most people in your situation can't help themselves. They think honesty will save them, that telling the truth will somehow protect them from consequences. He stood up, brushing sand from his old-fashioned trousers. But you understand something they don't. You understand that some truths are more dangerous than lies. 3:34 a.m. So I pass, I asked. With flying colors, he said, and there was genuine amusement in his voice. You've demonstrated exactly the kind of discretion we value in our neighbors. He started to walk away, then turned back as if remembering something. Oh, but there is one more thing. My stomach dropped. This was it, the real test, the final trap I hadn't seen coming. You owe us now, he said simply. What? A debt. We saved your life tonight. From the deer thing, from the consequences of witnessing what you witnessed. That kind of service doesn't come free. The casual way he said it made it clear this wasn't a negotiation. What kind of debt? The flexible kind, Leandro said with that half-mocking smile I was beginning to hate. When we call, you answer. When we need something, you provide it. When we require your professional expertise, you make yourself available. I'm a cop. I can't just... You can and you will. His voice carried the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. Because the alternative is much worse. For you, for your family, for anyone who might mourn your passing. He started walking again, heading back toward the deeper desert. Don't worry, Officer Moreno, we're not unreasonable. Most of what we'll ask will seem perfectly legitimate. A favor here, a blind eye there, maybe some information that could prove useful to our ongoing territorial negotiations. I wanted to refuse, wanted to tell him I'd never be part of whatever twisted game his family was playing in the desert shadows. But the words wouldn't come, because deep down, I knew he was right. I owed them my life, and in the world I'd stumbled into tonight, debts like that had to be paid. How will I know? I called after him. When you... call? He paused at the edge of a cluster of chala cactus, already becoming one with the shadows. Oh, you'll know. The desert has its ways of carrying messages to those who know how to listen. And then he was gone, vanished into the scrubland as completely as if he'd never existed. I stood alone among the bones and bloodstains, feeling the weight of invisible chains settling around my shoulders. 3:41 a.m. The walk back to my patrol car felt like a death march. Every step took me further from the world I'd known and deeper into something I couldn't understand or control. By the time I reached the crime scene, the investigation was wrapping up. Chen waved me over as the last of the equipment was loaded into the van. You missed all the fun, she said. Coroner thinks it was definitely animal predation. Coyotes, probably a whole pack of them. Poor woman must have been out here hiking, got disoriented in the dark. Any ID on her? Not yet, but there's a missing person report from Tucson. Sarah Martinez, 28, didn't come home from a weekend camping trip. Matches the general description. Chen closed her notebook with a snap. Probably went off trail, got lost, ended up as dinner for the local wildlife. Happens more than you'd think. I nodded, playing the part of the concerned officer gathering information for his report. Anything else I should know? Just the usual. Stay alert out here, especially on night shifts. Desert's full of predators. She climbed into her unmarked car. See you back at the station. As the convoy of official vehicles disappeared down the dirt road, their taillights fading to distant red dots, I found myself alone with the desert night. The silence was absolute now, heavy with the weight of secrets and lies and debts I couldn't repay. I keyed my radio. Dispatch, this is Unit 47, clearing Cemetery Mesa. False alarm on the disturbance call. Copy, Unit 47, any additional units needed? Negative. Just kids being kids. Ghost stories got them spooked. All quiet now. 3:52 a.m. The drive back to Highway 92 gave me time to think, though I wasn't sure thinking was what I needed. Everything felt surreal, like I was watching someone else's life unfold on a movie screen. The normal world, speed limits and radio calls and paperwork, seemed impossibly fragile compared to the violence I'd witnessed in the wash. I pulled over at the same spot where I'd first met Leandro hours earlier. Had it really only been a few hours? It felt like a lifetime had passed since I'd been a regular cop dealing with racing teenagers and routine patrols. The desert stretched out on both sides of the highway, endless and dark, and full of secrets I was just beginning to understand. Somewhere out there, the Arantes family was tending their wounds and counting their dead. Somewhere else, things that had once been dear were dissolving into bone dust and memory. And somewhere in between, a newly promoted deputy sheriff was learning that the job he'd taken for stability had just become the most dangerous thing he'd ever done. I thought about calling Sheriff Ramirez, confessing everything, asking for advice or backup or transfer to another county, but Leandro's words echoed in my memory. Some truths are more dangerous than lies. Who would believe me? Who could believe me? A story about territorial wars between impossible creatures, about wings stitched onto human backs, about the voices of the dead screaming from rotting throats. They'd think I'd suffered a complete psychological break, and maybe I had. Maybe that would be easier than accepting that the world was much stranger and more dangerous than I'd ever imagined. But the bloodstains under my fingernails were real. The tears in my uniform were real. The memory of those yellow eyes studying me like a predator evaluating prey. That was real too. 4:03 a.m. I started the engine and pulled back onto Highway 92, heading toward town and the station, and a report I'd have to file about nothing happening. About a quiet night in the desert where the only excitement was teenagers telling ghost stories. But as I drove through the darkness, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. Not malevolent exactly, but attentive. Interested. Like a cat watching a mouse it had decided not to kill just yet. The desert had claimed me tonight, made me part of its hidden ecosystem of predators and prey and things that fell somewhere in between. I'd survived by playing along, by proving I could keep their secrets and tell their lies. But survival came with a price. I owed them now, the Orantes family, and whatever they really were beneath their human masks. When they called, I would answer. When they needed something, I would provide it. When they required my professional expertise for their ongoing territorial wars, I would make myself available. The alternative, as Leandro had made clear, was much worse. I thought about Sarah Martinez, the woman whose body would be identified and returned to her family with a death certificate listing animal attack as cause of death. Her parents would never know what really killed their daughter. No one would ever know except me and the creatures that had torn her apart for crossing the wrong invisible line in the sand. That was my burden now, knowing the truth, but being unable to speak it. Carrying secrets that could destroy lives if revealed, but might destroy me if kept. The radio crackled to life, dispatch calling the end of shift for units across the county. Dawn was still hours away, but I could feel it coming in the way the desert air seemed to lighten, the way the darkness felt less absolute. Unit 47 returning to station, I reported. End of patrol. Copy that, Unit 47. Quiet night. I looked out at the endless desert, thinking about the battles fought in the darkness between things that shouldn't exist. Yeah, I said, real quiet. But as I drove toward the lights of town, I knew the quiet wouldn't last. The Orantes family was watching me now, waiting to see how I handled my new role as keeper of their secrets. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I could already hear them calling. The desert had its own laws, its own boundaries, its own debts that had to be paid, and I was part of that system now, whether I wanted to be or not. I'd survived by playing along. The question was, how long could I keep playing before